So today you will discover and explore the unfair world of the textile supply chain, but you will also realize that some actors and individuals are already doing great things to change the textile supply chains. I'm sure you all know, for instance, about the Rana Plaza event, and it was the top of the iceberg. But what has changed since then? Something we will discover today. Also, you know that in the history of fair trade, maybe some of you remember, we saw that fair textile products and doing fair textile products is not only to guarantee a fair remuneration, but also to preserve or to save at least not endangered traditional know-how. So this module will underline the role of fair trade organizations and campaigns to advocate for a slow fashion industry. As you know, the lineup of today's speakers is exceptional. So I would like to thank them all for being with us today. It's an honor to welcome you on board, Stéfanne Prijot. Stéfanne, she is a Belgian documentary filmmaker and photographer, and through the lens of her camera, she addresses topics such as human rights, climate change, gender, access to water, education, and health. The story of a panty and of those who make it is our first feature-length documentary film, and you will see some extract today. So, congrats for this, Stéfanne. Some of you also know her because she's a young fair trade advocate, and it's my pleasure to welcome on board Delphine Williot. She is also a policy and research coordinator at Fashion Revolution, and she is passionate about transforming the fashion industry into a fairer and environmentally conscious sector. She is joining Liv Simpliciano, policy and research coordinator at Fashion Revolution. And early in her career, Liv worked with one of the world's leading organizations to eliminate and remedy labor violations in supply chains, helping corporations, brands, and governments to understand the risk of forced labor and human trafficking in their supply chains. And the least but not the last, I'm very glad to welcome Marta Garda. She is our textile project coordinator at the FTAO. She has 5 years of experience working in the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade. She joined the FTAO in September to lead the advocacy work in the field of fair and sustainable textiles. And as you will see, she has a lot of work to do. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to all our speakers. And we will begin with a short introduction on the history of textile supply chains by Liv. And then we will have Stéfanne Prijot, we will talk about the story of the panties. So thank you all, and the floor is yours, Liv.
So for my present just introduction, I'm going to talk really about why is transparency needed, because I think it fits very nicely into, I guess, a history of textile supply chains since Rana Plaza. So as Didier mentioned, the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened 8 years ago on April 24th, 2013. It was a tragedy which killed 1,138 garment workers and injured many more, and which was a preventable accident. In fact, there were known risks and in an evacuation the day before because there were concerns for the visible cracks on the building. Garment workers from these factories, which were a majority of women workers, were ordered to go back in the factory or risk losing their jobs. This is in part due to the extreme pressure from brands to quickly deliver their orders and at any cost. So in the aftermath, human rights activists had to physically dig through the rubble, looking for clothing labels in order to figure out which brands were producing clothes there. And you can see that from this photo here. In some cases, it took weeks for brands to determine why their labels were found in the ruins and what sort of purchasing agreements they had with those suppliers at the Rana Plaza building site. If brands don't know where their clothes are being made and by whom, we cannot work to fix problems before they end in tragedy. And Rana Plaza really demonstrated this need for transparency. So what do we mean by transparency? So we define transparency as the public disclosure of information that enables people to hold decision makers to account. For the fashion industry, it means sharing information about supply chains, business practices, and the impacts of these practices on workers, communities, and the environment. Transparency, importantly, is not radical, but it is necessary. And it is not to be confused with sustainability. However, without transparency, achieving sustainable, accountable, and fair fashion industry will be almost impossible. So transparency is a critical first step on that journey. And this graphic really demonstrates what I've just said, is transparency is that driving force that illuminates issues in the supply chain and helps address those issues so that we can ultimately achieve a clean, safe, and fair fashion industry. So from Rana Plaza gave birth to the transparency movement, where consumers, civil society workers, and suppliers themselves demanded change within the industry. Of course, that is how Fashion Revolution started, but we'll get into that a bit later. But other important initiatives and organizations emerged as well. In 2016, several human rights and labor rights organizations, together with global unions, formed a coalition to improve transparency in the garment and footwear supply chains. The coalition developed and endorsed the Transparency Pledge, which created a common minimum standard for supply chain disclosure. Alongside the Transparency Pledge, a mix of other legislation was introduced to strengthen human rights due diligence, including, for example, the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015, the Australian Modern Slavery Act in 2018, and the Dutch Child Labour in Supply Chains Due Diligence Act in 2019. And most recently, the European Union this year, we should expect to see companies being required to proactively assess, act, and report on their human rights and environmental risks throughout their supply chains. And we will also see new rules coming out on how companies must deal with textile and clothing waste, and new government policies on product design, production processes, and mandatory product labeling when it comes to sustainability topics. So we've kind of touched upon this, but I'll just kind of go into it deeper on, why does transparency matter? So it's important to say that transparency alone wouldn't have prevented a tragedy like Rana Plaza, but a lack of transparency certainly contributed to that disaster. So it's important that information around supply chains is publicly available and transparent and not hidden behind closed doors. Because if we don't know what brands are producing where, we cannot hold brands accountable if something goes wrong. And it's useful for other stakeholders and NGOs on the ground. And this quote by Nazma Akhtar really captures that. So she said, brands who are sourcing from Bangladesh or wherever have to disclose all factory names and the details. It should be updated every 3 months to ensure information is accurate. And we can talk a little bit further around data sharing. So this graphic here kind of just summarizes the expanse of the fashion supply chain. So despite the size and impact of the industry, the quality of data in the apparel sector is quite poor, even at a basic level as name and address information. So the reason behind this is varied, including transliteration inconsistencies, a lack of structured address formats in key sourcing regions, the need to work with international character sets, as well as sloppy data entry or simply an Excel formula has gone wrong. So since Rana Plaza and the publication of research such as the Fashion Transparency Index, which is, of course, a Fashion Revolution project, it is evident that progress has been made in the amount of supply chain data being shared. However, one crucial element is how data is shared. So data is often shared in PLM systems through inaccessible maps or in PDF formats, which are non-machine readable or brand websites. And this makes working with data difficult and inefficient, making disclosure seem like a little more than a tick box exercise. So initiatives such as Open Apparel Registry have sprung up since Rana Plaza, and they are advocating for an open data standard for the apparel sector, which is a simple set of instructions for any organization to follow on how they share information about their supply chain. So by publishing data in an open, comparable, and machine-readable format, this moves transparency beyond a tick box exercise, which will result in greater efficiencies, facilitating interoperability, and ultimately improved supply chain conditions, both social and environmental. Because transparency data can expose overlaps and establish leverage if something goes wrong and needs remediating by stakeholders working together toward a common goal and recognizing their shared responsibility in doing so rather than duplicating efforts. So the main thing is that better data equals better efficiency. And we've come leaps and bounds since Rana Plaza. But there needs to be greater transparency and more disclosure. And finally, I know this has been a long introduction, but I'll just end on a very quick case study just to show how data is used. So this is a case study on the World Wildlife Fund and the Open Apparel Registry. So the World Wildlife Fund program has been looking to understand the apparel industry and how it is distributed around the world and how the global spread of facilities affects freshwater and biodiversity. So one of the tools they use in their work is the Open Apparel Registry, which is an open repository mapping facilities worldwide. So for example, when laying a map of the world's wetlands over the map of apparel facilities within the OAR, the overlap between the wetlands and apparel production zones helps World Wildlife Fund understand where best they can design projects. So this information helps them to understand who to approach to advanced wetland conservation, but also helps identify areas of potential wetland restoration and builds a stronger case for nature-based solutions. So transparency information helps lead to improvements both in environmental issues and human rights issues. And this drive for transparency was really born out of a tremendous tragedy. And it's great to see the progress over the last few years, and we'll kind of get into more detail about that later when we talk about Fashion Revolution.
I'm a documentary filmmaker, and my last documentary is the story of a panty and of those who make it. And the movie explains the different steps of the production of a panty. Indeed, I could have talked about the production of a t-shirt or jeans or a sweater, but I wanted to tell the story of very simple garments, very personal and 100% cotton made to simplify the supply chain. And since my childhood, I helped my mom to unpack clothes and store them in her shop. And 30 years ago, most of the clothes she sold were produced in Belgium. But over the last 20 years, the clothes mostly came from Asia and more recently from Africa. I wanted to know where the clothes actually came from, who made them, and in which condition. Also, I've worked during 7 years for Good Planet Belgium. It's an NGO working for sustainable development. I was educative officer and I create workshops on textile industry for teenagers. And I was very surprised when I asked them at the end of the workshop, do the lives have the same value? And some of them answered me like, if they work in the factory, it's their choice, or they are all Chinese. And so I wish to make a movie about the story of a panty, but mostly of all the story of those who make it, and show that behind their clothes produced far away, they are human, mostly women with a family, a heart, a soul. When I start to write the movie, to know the path of my panty, I organize a meeting with the organization HASHACT. HASHACT is the Belgian platform of NGOs defending the the workers' rights in the garment industry. And I saw them and I asked them, what is the path of the production of a panty? The next slide, you will see. that when I asked hashtag, so the question, what is the path of a panty? Actually, they laughed. They told me it's impossible to know. It's impossible to know the full origin of the clothes. It's a huge business. Traders buy and sell raw materials without asking where they come from. And there are so many stages, so many countries, so many contractors that the path is totally opaque. And this lack of transparency is a major problem we face. So for the movie, I choose the path of my panty, selecting the most plausible country. On the next slide, you see a picture you saw already with Believe. And then my path, you can see on the first we traveled to the Uzbek cotton field where we met Yulduz. Then we met Janaki, a girl who used to work in a spinning factory in India. Nearby, we met Mithili, who worked in a dyeing factory also in India. And after these 3 production steps, our panty is sent to Indonesia to be assembled, packed, and distributed around the world. And at least one of these places is my mom's shop in Belgium. So, of course, this long road obviously creates huge social and environmental impact around the world. So let's watch the first extract of the movie that takes place in Uzbekistan.
Bir pas eshitishadi, keladi, meni qidiradi. Bizda hali ham shunaqa so'z erkinligi yo'q. Aytib bo'lmaydi. O'shancha odamlar hammasi kerak bo'lsa orqasidan odam o'ldiraveradi. Alloh taolo ham aytadi, oqni oq, qorani qora deyish kerak. Men bular bilan ko'rishib, sizlar gaplashganimda men rosa xursandman. Chunki ichimdagi gaplarni aytdim, yengil bo'ldim.
Boshqatdanmi?
Yoshligimizdan paxta dalasida ishlab, mehnat bilan katta bo'lganmiz. Har kuni boradigan bo'ldik. Har kuni. Masalan, biz yosh bola bo'lsak, 30 kilo, 50 kilo norma. Katta mashinaga chiqib, hali mashina bortovoy mashinaga chiqib borganmiz. Xuddi to'kib borgandek dalaga tashadi bizni. Birinchi sinf qanday paxta, nimaligini yulib tashlaydi paxtani. Birinchi sinfda shu dalaga borganmiz maktab. O'qituvchilar ham qo'rqardi. Xuddaligi odamlar robot etilab turadi.
O'zbekiston paxtaga yaxshi-da. Paxtadan hosildan oylik berib turadi, pul. Keyin o'sib ketgandan keyin chikanka qilinadi. Yanada o'sadi-ku, kattarib ketmaslik uchun. Keyin sug'oradi, dori soladi. Davlatga biz topshiramiz, ular bizga kunjara beradi. Terib topshirganimizga nima qiladi endi? Terib topshiramiz. Yo'q deb ayta olmaydi. Unga juda og'ir bo'ladi u odamga. 60 kilo, 70 kilo iyi. Norma termaganlarni o'sha ishxonalardan boradi-ku. Norma termasa puliga teruvchilardan sotib, normani qilib beradi. 1 kilometrni olib borib chopib, qanday chopadi? Misol 2000 so'mga nima 2 ta non beradi. Nima uchun aytmaysizlar? To'g'risini ayting, o'zingizni haqqingizni talab qiling, haq huquqingizni talab qilsangiz bo'ladi-ku desiz. Deb qo'rqoq ayollar ham, boshimizga problema kerak emas deydi. Keyin deydi, ana keladi uyimizga deydi, dam ko'p, sen nega shunday qilding? Bunday, mana sen pasobiyan yo'q, hech narsa kerak emas, sen yo'qol kerak bo'lsa deb. Yomon qo'rqatdi.
Paxtani yetishtiramiz, keyin paxta terganlarga yaxshi tersa, aytdi, bu yoqda 22, bu yoqda necha gektar dadasi? Mana yerda Sardorning yerida 4 gektarmi, 5 gektar shunday. Hozir sotib oluvdi, yana qolganini ham bajar deb yotdi deydi. Bajarmasang yeringni olaman deb yotdi deydi, topshir deb yotdi deydi. 100%. O, naqd yoziladi. Fermer bobo uxlayapti. Abitda.
Shuni yozib qo'ysin. Benim bitta qizim bor, 90-yil. Shu qizim kollejga o'qishga kirdi. 1-kurs, qarang. 4 kun o'qidi sentyabrda, paxtaga deyapti. Shu qizim men paxtaga bormayman. Bormayman paxtaga. Borasan dedi. Bo'lmasa o'qishdan ketasan, kessam ketaman dedi. Lekin paxtaga bormayman. Bir kun ham paxtaga bormadim. Mana shu Umidjon deyapsiz. O'sha qizim kollejda o'qolmadi. Nima deysiz Umidjon? Ana ayting. Ha, o'qiydi, baribir o'qiyman deydi. Kollejda o'qiyman, institutda o'qiyman deydi o'sha qiz.
Orol. Mirzacho'l, Jizzax. Jizzaxda Samarqand, Qarshi, Termiz. Vodiylarga ajratgani bu xaritada emasda, boshqa xarita deydi. Xaritasi oldinda yo'q. Unga Amudaryo bilan Surxondaryodan suv borgan avval. Hozir ekin maydoni ko'payib, paxta ekilib, keyin g'alla ekilib, suv bormay qo'yganda Amudaryo bilan Sirdaryoni suv bormay qo'ygan. Qurigan hozir. Qurib cho'llashgan. Qum bo'lib yotib hamma joy hozir. Qum natijasida bo'ronlar yuzaga keladi. Keyin kasalliklar ko'p chiqyapti. Ayollar kasallanyapti, bolalar nogiron tug'ilishi yuzaga kelyapti. Qumli bo'ronlar ko'p bo'lyapti. Orol qurigan natijasida. Endi tiklab bo'lmaydi Orol.
Paxtaga juda ko'p suv kerak bo'ladi. Orol dengizini ketishini Isrof Karim otamiz bor edi. Lekin uni asrab qolish olmadi. Oddiy bil xalq nima qilsin? Hech narsa qiladi.
Yes, in Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan is the 5th exporter of cotton in the world. And this is a unique case in the world where the government itself is the owner of the production. And as you saw during the harvest season, the government sent 1 million employees and students to the fields on a forced volunteer contract. This is obviously a form of modern slavery. And Uzbekistan, there is the Aral Sea, which is used to be the 4th largest saltwater sea in the world. And with the intensification of cotton farming, which is very, very demanding in terms of water, the Aral Sea has lost 90% of this water. And by losing the Aral Sea, hundreds of species of plants, fish, birds have disappeared. So it's a huge loss for biodiversity. And in the world, cotton cultivation accounts for 24% of the world's pesticide produced. So in Uzbekistan, this crop represents various problems of human and environmental health. After Uzbekistan, we went to India. India is the second largest textile exporter after China. And the textile industry is the second largest employer in the country after agriculture. And most of the 45 million Indians workers in the textile industry mostly are women. So let's watch a second extract in the spinning factory and in the dyeing factory.
ரோடு அது வந்து செக்யூரிட்டி மெயின் செக்யூரிட்டி இருப்பாங்க. இங்கே வந்து ரெக்ரூட்மெண்ட் ஹால், பேரண்ட்ஸ் ஹாலு, ஹாஸ்டல் வந்து உள்ளே போகணும். ப்ளூ ரூம். இங்கே வந்து மிஷின் பஞ்சு ஓடுது. இந்த மிஷின் வழியாக ஸ்பின்னிங் வருது பஞ்சு. ஒரு ரூமில் வந்து பெரிய ரூம்னால் டர்னில் திரும்புகிற இடத்துல மட்டும் அங்கே வந்து ஒரு 30 பேர் 20 பேர் இருப்பாங்க. சின்ன ரூம்னால் நாங்கள் வந்து கீழே வந்து 15 ஒரு ரூமில் 12 பேர் தான் இருக்கணும். 18 பேர் இருப்பாங்க, 12 பேர் இருப்பாங்க. ஒவ்வொரு ரூமில் 70 பேர் இருப்பாங்க. நாங்கள் வந்து எடுக்கலாங்கிறாங்களா, எடுக்கக்கூடாது. அவங்க எடுத்துகிட்டு போயிடுவாங்க. எடுத்துகிட்டு போனதுக்கப்புறம் வந்து அப்படியே அவங்க போய் கேட்டாலும் பேரண்ட்ஸ் எப்போ வராங்களோ அவங்ககிட்ட கொடுத்து அனுப்பிடுவாங்க. ஆனால் சம்மந்தப்பட்டவங்க பொண்ணுக்கிட்ட கொடுக்க மாட்டாங்க.
இப்படி அனுப்புவாங்க. வேலைக்கு ஆள் வேணும்னு சொன்னோம். சரி நாங்கள் வீட்டில் எல்லாம் பாதுகாப்பாக இருக்கட்டும் குழந்தைங்க அப்படின்னு கொண்டு விடுறோங்க. வீட்டில் இருந்தால் எல்லாம் அங்கே எங்கேயும் போவாங்க பொட்ட பிள்ளைங்க, அதனால பாதுகாப்பாக இருக்கட்டும்னு கொண்டு விடுறோம். எந்த மாதிரி ஜாதியாக இருந்தாலும் கூட்டிகிட்டு போவாங்க வேலைக்கு, எல்லாருக்குமே கூட்டிகிட்டு போவாங்க. அப்படியெல்லாம் நாங்கள் சொல்லித்தானே விட்டோம். நாங்கள் கேட்கும்போது இல்லைன்னா பிள்ளைய நாங்கள் கூட்டிகிட்டு போயிடுறோம்.
கொண்டாந்து கலர்தான்
அந்த பிள்ளைய அனுப்புங்க அப்படின்னா அந்த பிள்ளைய கொண்டு வந்து விடுங்க, அந்த பிள்ளைய விடுற அப்படிங்கிறாங்களே இருக்கு அப்படின்ட்டு இருக்கிறேன். அந்த பொண்ணு நான் சரி 3 வருஷம் முடிச்சுட்டே வந்துடுறேன் அப்படின்னு சொல்லுதுங்க எங்கள் பொண்ணு, சொன்ன பொண்ணு.
நான் மே மாதத்தில் எப்படினாலும் பொண்ணுங்க வீட்டில் இருப்பாங்க அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு கம்பெனிக்காரங்களுக்கே தெரியும். இப்போ தான் எக்ஸாம் இப்போலாம் முடியுது அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு அவங்களுக்கே தெரியும். அந்த மாதிரி ஊர் ஊராக போய்க்கிறாங்க. அந்த மாதிரி இங்கேயும் வந்து பொண்ணுங்க கேட்டாங்க. அதுக்கப்புறம் அவங்க வந்து கேட்டதுக்கப்புறம் நாங்கள் வரமாட்டோன்னு சொன்னோம். அதுக்கப்புறம் சரி கொஞ்ச நாள் வீட்டில் தான் இருக்கிறோம், போய் பார்க்கலாம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு நாங்கள் போனோம். அதுக்கப்புறம் எங்களையும் கூப்பிட்டு இன்னொரு ஊருக்கு கூப்பிட்டு போனாங்க. எங்களை அறிமுகப்படுத்தி திரும்ப அந்த பொண்ணுங்களையும் கூப்பிட்டு போகலாம் அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரி பிளான் பண்ணாங்க. ஆனால் அந்த சைடு பனாரஸ் சைடு வந்து அங்கேருந்து வர ரொம்ப நேரம் ஆகும். ஃபஸ்ட் நாள் போனப்போ எதுவுமே கேட்கல. அதுக்கப்புறம் சாருங்களோட அங்கே போய் சும்மா உட்காந்துருப்போம், டான்ஸு அதுன்னு சொல்லி இதெல்லாம் வாஷிங் ஏரியா அந்த மாதிரி டிபார்ட்மெண்ட்டு அது இதுன்னு எல்லாத்தையும் சுற்றி காட்டுவாங்க. செகண்ட் நாள் வந்து பிடிச்சிருக்கா அப்படின்னு சொல்லி கேட்பாங்க. பிடிச்சிருந்தா நம்ம அதில் சைன் பண்ணணும். பிடிக்கலன்னா அந்த ஒரு நாளையே நம்ம எல்லாத்தையும் சுற்றி பார்த்துட்டு எனக்கு பிடிக்கலன்னு சொல்லிட்டு போயிடலாம். சைன் பண்ணதுக்கப்புறம் நம்ம போகிறோன்னு விருப்பப்பட்டாலுமே நம்ம போக முடியாது. 6 மாதத்துக்கு அப்புறம் தான் போகணும் நீங்கள் அப்படின்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. அடுத்து 3ஆவது நாள் அவங்க வந்து வாஷிங் ஏரியா அது இதுன்னு சுற்றி காட்டுவாங்க. அப்புறம் ஆடிட்டிங் வந்தாங்கன்னா எப்படி சொல்லணும், அவங்ககிட்ட எப்படி பேசணும். 7ஆவது நாள் திரும்பவும் நாங்கள் போய் ரொம்ப நேரம் வேலை பார்த்துட்டு 7ஆவது நாள் ஷிஃப்ட் போட்டுருவாங்க. பொண்ணுங்களை வந்து அடிமைத்தனமாக வேலை செஞ்சு கல்யாணம் ஆனவங்கள மாதிரியே அவங்கள வேலை முதியோர் மாதிரி வேலை செய்ய வைக்கிறது, ரொம்ப கஷ்டப்படுத்துறது. இதுதான் சுமங்கலி ஸ்கீம் சொல்கிறாங்க. மில்லில் பொண்ணுங்களை வந்து கஷ்டப்படுத்தி இந்த 1 வருஷத்தில் எனக்கு சொன்னாங்க. இப்போ நம்ம மில்லில் வந்து எல்லாருமே மில்லுக்கு போகிற பொண்ணுங்களை சுமங்கலி ஸ்கீம்னு சொல்லிட்டு இருக்கிறாங்க. அந்த மாதிரி நம்ம வெளியே சொல்லக்கூடாது. அப்புறம் மில்லில் வந்து இதெல்லாம் நடக்குது, அதெல்லாம் ஆடிட்டிங் வந்தாங்களோ எங்களை மாற்றி சொல்லுவாங்க. கம்டம்ஸா கேட்டு பாருங்க. எங்களை
கம்பெனிக்கு போய் இருக்கிற கடனை அடிக்கணுங்க என்ன ஃபர்ஸ்ட். கம்பெனிக்கு போய் இருக்கிற கடனை அடிச்சோம்னா போதுங்கண்ணா, அதுதான் ஃபர்ஸ்ட்.
ஜட்டி கம்பெனியா? நிக்கர் கம்பெனி. இவர் நிக்கர் கம்பெனி, இவர் பனியன் கிளாத் கம்பெனி. எக்ஸ்போர்ட் கம்பெனி, இவங்க லோக்கல் கம்பெனி.
அவங்க ஒரு வாரத்தில் ஹெச் பண்ணாங்க. 50 ரூபா ஹெச் பண்ணாங்க எல்லாத்துக்கு. ஆனால் தமிழ் பிள்ளைங்களுக்கு அது மாதிரி ஹெச் பண்ணவே இல்லைங்க. அவங்க சம்பளம் என்னாலுமே கம்மியாக தான் வாங்கிட்டு இருக்காங்க.
இங்கே நிறைய பேர் அப்படிதான். அந்த மில்லுக்கு போயிட்டு வந்ததுலேருந்து குழந்தை இல்லாமல் நிறைய பேர் நிறைய பிரச்சனைலாம் இருக்கிறாங்க. ஊசி போட்டுலாம்
அப்போல்லாம் வந்து காடு தோட்டமாக இருந்தது. அப்போ காட்டையெல்லாம் விற்கம் கட்டி சிப்காட்டுக்காரங்க வாங்கி இந்த மாதிரி கம்பெனியெல்லாம் கட்டி. ஆனால் வந்து சம்பளம் தான் கட்டு வேலை ஆகலை. ஆனால் வேலை இங்கே எதுவுமே இல்லை. அதாவது இந்த தோட்டத்தை வேலை காட்டு வேலையெல்லாம் தெரியும், ஆனால் இருந்தாலும் வேலை இல்லை. அது வந்து அதனால வந்து வேலைக்கு இங்கே போயே தான் ஆகணுன்ன மாதிரி வேறு பக்கம் எங்கேயும் போகாத மாதிரி கம்பெனியே இங்கே பூரா இருக்குது. காஸ்டியூம், ஐட்ரோஸு, ஆசிட்டு, அப்புறம் இதான் சால்ட்டு, கெமிக்கலு, அப்புறம் இது டைஸு. குழந்தைகளுக்கும் பாதிப்பு வருது. பூரா இது நோயெல்லாம் அதிகமாக வருது, வயிற்றுப்போக்கு வருது. இப்போ பிள்ளைங்களுக்கு ரொம்பவுமே முடியறதில்ல. தண்ணி சுத்தமாக கெட்டு போச்சு.
ஒரு 400 சாய் ஃபேக்ட்ரி இருக்குது. கலர் இப்படி தான் இருக்கும் தண்ணி இந்த இடத்துல எல்லாம். இங்குள்ள இதுக்கு அப்படித்தான் இருக்குது, இருந்துகிட்ருக்குது. வந்து இந்த தண்ணி இந்த வழியாக தான் போயிட்டுருக்குது. இதெல்லாம் கழிவு நீர் சுத்தம் பண்ணி விட்றது, இதெல்லாம் சுத்தம் பண்ணி கழிவு நீர் போயிட்டுருக்குது. இப்படியே இது வரைக்கும் போயிட்டே இருக்க வேண்டியது. அது வரைக்கும் போகும்.
As you have seen, the girls in India are Sumangali. The Sumangali system consists of giving jobs as textile workers to underage Dalit girls to pay the dowry. And the Sumangali girls live inside the factory during 3 years and cannot leave it. And the Sumangali system is very present in the spinning factory in India, in the Tamil Nadu region. Concerning the dyeing industry, during our stay, we met workers living close to the factory, and they told us that amongst women, there are many cases of infertility and children born with disability. Indeed, dyeing is a very polluting and toxic activity. The air and water pollution due to the toxic dyeing products have various health consequences on workers, often unprotected, on the people who consume the water, on irrigated culture, and on biodiversity. After the dyeing industry, we went to Indonesia. And Indonesia is the 10th largest exporter of textile in the world. And the textile industry is one of the lowest paid job in Indonesia. 37% of factories workers are paid less than the minimum wage. There's a difference between the minimum wage and the living wage. So the minimum wage is only for one person, and the living wage is earned on a normal working time, which cover the basic needs of the worker and her family: housing, food, clothing, healthcare, access to education. So in the last extract, you will see Rizma, suing worker demanding for living wage system in Indonesia. It's a shorter extract. Yes, so it was for Indonesia. And after this, the panty in the movie is sent to Belgium, where we are invited to buy, and buy more. And in Belgium, 93,000 tons of textile are waste each year. And in Europe, 6 million tons of textile are waste each year. And so the textile is the second most polluting industry after the oil sector, because it's not only the manufacture and transportation, but also the management of the textile waste that is polluting, because the big chains burn their unsold goods. So you see, the textile industry, it has a big impact on people's lives and on our planet. Fortunately, there are solutions, and there are people who are advocating for change. But that we will see with Marta and Delphine, I think.
I thought I'll just give a very brief introduction of myself. I'm rather new to the advocacy world. I joined the FTAO, as Didier said, in September, and I work specifically on textile sector and textile supply chains. And I lead our advocacy work at EU level. So in a way, I also consider myself as a young fair trade advocate, because I'm not in the sector since a long time. What I would like to talk to speak about today is a presentation of the topic, how to make textile supply chains more, because I thought I'd be a bit more realistic, so more fair and sustainable. And what are the EU policies that affect the textile sector? So I'll give you a bit more the EU policy angle of this issue. Like I said, I have experience with complex textile supply chains, and I made very brief here, because Liv already gave a very nice introduction, very nice explanation during the introduction. But this is just a simplified example of the value chain of a textile company. And what we usually talk about tier, which are the suppliers, so the layers of supplier. We say tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and the further we go with the numbering of tier, the more complex, of course, it becomes, the supply chain becomes, because it means that there are many intermediary steps between the first, let's say, process, the first step, which would be the raw materials, so cotton farming, for example, and the end product, so let's say a t-shirt. It is not uncommon for big apparel brands, so clothing brand, to have more than 1,000 suppliers, which are spread across several countries and continents. And that should give you already an idea of the large scale of the issue and the complexity of this sector. Also, to complicate things even more, textile supply chains normally involve many layers of agents, contractors, and subcontractors. So if we would like to draw a supply chain for textile, it would be rather a web than a linear chain. Before we go into the figures, to briefly introduce the textile sector. So when we talk about the textile industry, we say textile and not clothing or apparel, because textile includes not only clothes, but also home and industrial textile, for instance. Is one of the biggest sector worldwide in monetary terms. It employs millions of people, especially women, as we have seen in the documentary made by Stéfanne. I think almost all the people that spoke were women. So it represents a great source of sustenance to a lot of families, and it is potentially a great means for economic development, and to exit from poverty, but especially in low-income producing countries in the global south, like Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, just to name the biggest, or Indonesia, as we saw just now. But so it has a huge potential, like the sentence that Superman says, no, was it like Spider-Man? Huge potential, but a huge responsibility as well. Because let's face it, I mean, it is a sector where, which is sadly well known for the huge human and environmental harm that it creates. And as Liv was showing, the Rana Plaza that happened in April 2013 is only one of the tragic examples. And just to give you some figures that I think they help understanding the problem better. In the EU, the textile and clothing industry in the EU alone employed 1.5 million people in 2019 and generated a turnover of 162 billion euro. Talking about EU27 without the UK. Some other more striking figures about the textile sector. Sorry about the lack of color, but I thought it was more dramatic to show it here, like this in all in gray. So 92 million tons of waste are produced annually by the global textile and clothing industry, so globally. Then if we zoom into the EU, we have 5.6 million tons of textile waste that were generated in 2013. Sorry, this is a bit outdated as data, but I think its figures are very similar for more recent years. 22 current textile collection rates of textile that are used for reuse or recycling is as low as 20-25%. So this shows that also the life cycle of textile is rather short. On average, textile collected in Europe have a local so reuse potential of 5 to 15%, and a further international reuse potential of 30 to 40%. Another 30 to 40% is destined for low quality recycle, what is called downcycling. And 10 to 15% must be disposed of. So that means it goes into incineration, so it is burnt, or it ends up in landfill. So high quality textile to textile recycling is virtually non-existent at the moment, and only 1% of materials used in textile production are recycled. For the sources of all these figures and more, you can check page 3 of the shadow strategy. As we said before, each European consumes an average of 26 kilograms of clothes every year, of which 11 kilograms are discarded. But the question that I would like to raise with you today is what can be done at EU policy level, so to make the most out of the huge economic potential of the textile sector, but at the same time making sure that the revenues that it generates do not come at human cost and environmental costs, so loss of natural resources and ecosystems. I know this is a difficult question. It hinders divergent and sometimes opposite views because many famous fast fashion companies like Inditex or H&M, just to name some that we all know, are in fact European companies. So they generate many jobs and revenue in the EU. And They are powerful stakeholder in the textile industry, and their voice is amongst the strongest, and of course cannot be ignored by policymakers because they also operate in the European market. But what I would like, the message that I would like to pass today is that it is not like a fight between the bad guys who are the companies and us as civil society that are like the good guys. But it is a legislative challenge, and the EU the EU role is that of ensuring that the right regulatory framework is put in place to make the textile sector more fair and sustainable. To come back to this question, what can the EU do? So currently, there are two like hot files at EU level that have an impact. The first directly, as you can see in the title, textile strategy. The second indirectly on the textile sector. So I would like to explain a bit what are the main asks from a civil society point of view for these two proposals that are currently they're work in progress at EU level. The EU textile strategy, it is expected in the first quarter of next year. It has been delayed. It was supposed to come out before that, but okay, let's hope that the Commission takes this extra time to be even more, adamant in making like a very comprehensive proposal, and once that delivers. So to give you a bit of the political context of this not piece of legislation, but like communication. It comes from the 2020 Circular Economy Action Plan, and in the context of the Green Deal. It should foster the European competitiveness and growth. The initial approach was almost exclusively about environment, so the environmental impact of textile sector. But during the process, and also thanks to big advocacy efforts by many civil society organizations, as Fair Trade Advocacy Office included, proudly. Now the social dimension is very much debated, and hopefully will be effectively included in the final proposal. We at the FTAO are part of a coalition of 65 civil society organizations with very diverse expertise and focus. And I thought it would be interesting for you as young advocates, or maybe if you would like to work on advocacy, that I explain you a bit what we have done so far as the coalition of civil society. So you can kind of draw a bit what has been so far our advocacy strategy. So we created this coalition together, and to give you an idea, I mean, there is a really wide range of organizations there. Some of them are active in gender-related issues, others on workers' rights, others on recycling, others on reuse. So really like a wide spectrum of expertise. We have created this coalition. Together we have co-created, let's say co-drafted, a shadow strategy, which is the one to which I sent you the link now, which is basically, essentially the idea is to put put in written form as if it was the EU textile strategy, what we think that this document should include. So that's why we have called it shadow strategy. After we have disseminated it widely amongst the MEPs, so member of the European Parliament, 53 of them have endorsed it and have expressed their support with the letter that was sent to the EU commissioners for environment, trade, international partnership, and justice, which are the four DG, so Directorate Generals that are more involved in this process, in this file. Then we have, and we are still doing a continuous follow-up with the Commission. So we send requests for meetings, we do calls with them, we participate in workshops. And of course, we provided inputs during the public consultation process that happened over the summer. And also maybe interesting for you to understand what kind of document this textile strategy will be. So as I said in the beginning, this will be a communication. So it is a non-binding legal instrument whose aim is that of normally it is used to identify a problem in a certain policy area and to provide a framework of how the future policy should address this issue. It can include a wide set of different regulatory and non-regulatory measures. So what we as Fair Trade Advocacy Office with all the other civil society think that the EU textile strategy should include. So essentially, and I will try to be brief really because this is something I'm very passionate about, but I will really squeeze the content. So essentially, we think that the environmental, the social, and the governance dimensions should be considered and addressed in a comprehensive and holistic manner. Just to give you an example of an issue that encompasses these three dimensions is what Stéfanne showed just before with in one of the extracts, this river that was highly polluted with chemicals. It's a clear example of, well, an environmental harm because it's a pollution, hazardous chemicals that go into the water, but it's also a social harm because the local communities that live across this river, they cannot use the water anymore, and as she was saying, they also have developed some diseases that were caused by those chemicals. So really the problem is like the social and the environmental dimension needs to be tackled simultaneously. In the textile sector, one of the biggest social and human harm is caused by the great power imbalances that affect the sector between the buyers and the suppliers. And that allows, this power imbalance allows the buyers to impose unilateral and what we call unfair trading practices, or abbreviated UTP, on the suppliers. Just to give you an example of what UTPs are, very short lead times, late payment terms, often more than 2 months after they have received the merchandise, low prices. Of course, all of these have been worse than during the COVID with a lot of last-minute order cancellations. And what happens in the practice is that this pressure that is on the suppliers is then translated into pressure on the workers. So the workers are the one that pays the most serious consequences of those unfair trading practices. So they are often unpaid and forced to work overtime, as we have seen in the documentary as well. They have extremely low wages, well below the living wage, what would be a living wage. There is a lack of the pressure that is put on the suppliers makes them to often skip basic safety rules in garment factories that sadly can lead to accidents like the one in Rana Plaza. And work in the garment sector is often unregulated. These kind of abuses, of course, they happen especially in producing countries, which are also low-income countries, so Bangladesh, Indonesia, Cambodia, where also national laws on social protection are quite weak and corruption is very high. I think this lady in the extract was also saying, like, if we call the authority, they will not help us. So this is a problem that is very tangible for people. What we advocate for is for the textile strategy to address the problem of UTPs through a legislation that should prohibit and sanctions the most harmful UTP that are happening in the sector. I don't know if you're aware, but in 2019, there was a directive, so this time like binding legislation on UTPs in the agri-food sector. And this directive, we think that could serve as a very good example of a similar piece of legislation that could be done for high-risk sectors like the textile sector. So that was on let's say on the social harm. If we move to environmental harm, environmental impact, this is caused by, and Liv stressed it very in a very strong way in the beginning, the lack of transparency and the lack of strong and binding requirement on transparency and traceability. Like we don't have currently, it's not mandatory to disclose information on recyclable content of the clothes, on the use of hazardous chemicals throughout the whole supply chain. Because often those chemicals are used at the very beginning of the supply chain, and disclosure most of the time is done only for the first year. So what is like the latest, let's say, step in the manufacturing process. And we, civil society, we advocate for the creation of European quantitative targets on textile production and waste generation. Because this is a sensitive topic, of course, to put a cap on textile production in the EU, which is, as we said, one of the main source of income. But I mean, let's face it, we need to produce more and to consume more. And I think that maybe Delphine will tackle this issue of consumption after me. But that's for sure one of the main problem. What we also ask is for mandatory requirements on durability, reusability, recyclability, which are not the same thing, to promote a truly circular textile sector. Because let's not forget that this whole idea of having a EU textile strategy comes from the Circular Economy Action Plan. And a circular business model means that is one that precisely reduces the amount of natural resources that enter into the system, and at the same time reduce the quantity of waste that comes out. So not a linear model, but as the word says, like a circular one. what we advocate for is also for the EU to support and promote these innovative circular business models, because it is a bit against the stream, but there are actors in the EU that are already putting in place best practices. Slow fashion, ethic fashion, fair trade fashion, these are realities that exist, but of course they need a regulatory framework to scale up. We need a regulatory framework to scale up this model, this virtuous model on a large scale. What the EU can do is also using its huge trade power. So when negotiating free trade agreements, there are other kind of agreements as a leverage, for example, through incentives to market access, when to foster more ambitious labor and environmental protection law in trading partners that are also textile producing countries. Another thing that the EU could and should do is put the creation of a sustainable textile supply chains as one of the top priority in its development cooperation list of priority. And that could be done, for example, by providing local support to governments in this producing country, by let's say promoting capacity building also through European staff in EU delegations. So that was a bit like our idea as civil society on what the EU textile strategy should look like. And our recommendations for you, because the initial question was like, what the EU can do. So we think that there's a lot that the EU can do, and these are some suggestions. So on the second hot file, which is the HREDD legislation, that stands for Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence. Latest news: this proposal will also be delayed, so it should come out in early 2022. This is a proposal for it's part of the what is called the Sustainable Corporate Governance SCG initiative. It's a proposal for a directive, so this time a legally binding act that establishes a set of objectives then all member states needs to implement in their national law, although they can choose how to transpose it into national laws. This legislation was first announced by Commissioner for Justice Reinders, who said that in 2021, so okay, now it's 2022, but let's hope it's the beginning of 2022, the EU would take legislative steps on mandatory due diligence for companies. Contrary to the EU textile strategy, the HREDD legislation is not directly linked to the textile sector, but it is a horizontal proposal that covers all companies across sectors. Once it will be released, it will be a legislative act that will establish mandatory due diligence requirements for all companies operating in the EU market, so not only based, but operating in the EU market. Meaning that they will be responsible for any environmental and human rights abuses that happen during their supply chain or value chain, and they will have an obligation to put in place processes to avoid or mitigate those abuses, those impacts. We think that it is this piece of legislation has a huge potential deliver and to bring about like long-lasting change, especially in high-risk sectors as the textile sector. So here again, the question: what then you can do to make the textile supply chain more fair and sustainable? Again, a lot potentially. We at the FTAO we advocate for this HREDD legislation to apply to all companies, regardless of their size. Of course, with also some supporting mechanism for SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. It should encompass all business operations, not only those directly linked, where there is a direct contractual link with the mother company, but all business operations throughout the whole supply chain. Because as we saw also in the documentary, most of the times environmental and human rights abuses happen at the beginning of the supply chain. Mandatory disclosure of information on production and processing sites, so that what has happened in Rana Plaza won't happen again, because as Liv was explaining, companies were not aware themselves even of if their clothes were being produced there or not. So they had to go and check the name tags on the clothes. Another thing that should be included in HREDD is that workers should also participate in the due diligence process. And especially when we talk about human rights due diligence, they would be the one paying the cost. So it is important that they have a voice in this process. Another thing that we hope it will be implemented is the establishment of mandatory annual implementation reports by companies, which would be like a document in which they have to explain what they are doing in practical terms to address the environmental and human rights issues that have been identified in their supply chains. And last but not least, putting in place an enforcement mechanism so that competent authorities can ensure compliance, and what is called a grievance mechanism, so access to justice for victims of human rights and environmental abuses without the fear for retaliation. So that was it. I hope it was not too boring. I know sometimes talking about EU policies, it's a bit, can cause a bit of a headache, but it is something that at the end of the day has a huge impact on us and on people on the planet.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be joining this panel, especially seeing as I'm usually on the other side of the of the presentation. So I'm very excited to talk about Fashion Revolution's work today. So we're going to look at what Fashion Revolution is to start with, then our vision and approach and the different campaigns we're working on at the moment. And then we'll look at different ways on how you can take action. So what is Fashion Revolution? So Fashion Revolution, as we like to say, is the world's largest fashion activism movement. So what does that mean? So that means we're a global movement that was created after the collapse of Rana Plaza in 2013 by our founders, Ursula de Castro and Carrie Summers. So they really felt that the fashion industry was not transparent, very incredibly opaque, and there were a lot of, because of this, we weren't able to address environmental and human rights issues. And because the fashion supply chains are incredibly opaque, we're not able to address these issues from a regulatory perspective and from an industry perspective. So by creating this movement, we operate in over 90 countries, I think. So we have different countries of volunteers around the world who come together, whether they're designers, academics, writers, business leaders, policymakers, and so on. And within their own country, advocate for, on one hand, change in legislation, change in industry, and also advocate for greater awareness within the industry. So what is our vision? So our vision is ultimately a global fashion industry that conserves and restores the environment and values people over growth and profit. So I think that's fairly straightforward. So with this in mind, we work on 3 different levels. So we work on policy change, cultural change, and industry change. So to start off with policy change. So this is mainly what our team is in charge of, as Liv and I are part of the policy team. So I think we're one of the only fashion NGOs that is lucky enough to be working within and outside the fashion system. So I'll go into a bit more detail as to what that means. So by working outside the fashion system, that means that we're able to advocate for policy changes and influence governments in terms of new legislation and how to enforce the legislations we would like to see within the fashion industry. So for instance, as Marta mentioned, by building coalitions that we are also part of regarding the EU textile strategy, and also within the UK legislation, we've also been able to take part in different consultations. So there was, for instance, something called the Environmental Audit Committee that was basically looking at the fashion industry and the environmental impact linked to the fashion industry. So during that process, the audit committee interviewed a lot of high street brands and fast fashion brands, and we were able to be consulted on the environmental issues that we believe the government should put legislation on. So that's one way that we work. So we're able to influence governmental legislation by, on one hand, being part of different coalitions for better regulation, and on the other hand, also take part in individual consultations directly with the government and be consulted on these issues. So that also includes the mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence that we will influence through our upcoming campaign on living wage, as we hope to do so. So another way we influence policy is also through our campaigning efforts. So next we have cultural change. So cultural change, what does that mean? So ultimately we started off as a movement also on social media. And with this, we understand that we have a huge platform to influence consumers in their daily purchases and in their daily life, as well as their awareness on the environmental and human rights, environmental impacts of the fashion industry. So for instance, this is why we've created different campaigns on social media, like Who Made My Clothes, which is to highlight the lack of transparency and traceability within the fashion industry at tier 1 level. And then Who Made My Fabric and What's in My Clothes, which are other campaigns striving to actively highlight these issues in the fashion industry. So we're also creating tools for people to use and leverage use their voice basically as a way to not only target brands, but also target governments in order to change legislation and also change the way brands are operating. As we know that, for instance, if a million people send an email to a brand regarding a specific environmental issue, we know at some point it will be escalated and they will have to publish a policy regarding this issue and they will have to communicate on this. And that also includes running free online courses, looking at the fashion industry's social and environmental impacts. So I've added at the end of our presentation some few links that you can check out. And lastly, we also look at industry change. So this is another way that we work inside the industry. And I think this is what I was saying earlier when I was saying that we're one of the only organizations that is able to also have direct conversations with brands. And how do we do that? By conducting research that highlights the social and environmental impacts of the industry, and we can leverage brands' competitive tendencies. So for instance, through our Fashion Transparency Index, I will let Liv explain what that entails, but basically we publish a report every year looking at the environmental and human rights impacts and policies and practices of 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers. And because a lot of brands now know that there is a financial asset to being part of this index and having a high score, not that it means that they're transparent, but it means that they're sustainable, but it means that they're transparent. We know that it will push them to be more transparent. And every year we see that more and more brands are actively taking part in our research and are actively trying to improve their score. And we can, by having these direct conversations with brands, we're also able to influence the decisions for future practices and policies. And we can also showcase and champion smaller innovative brands through our Fashion Open Studio program, which is basically a program looking at smaller designers and how they are embedding human rights and environmental practices within their business. So with this, I'll let Liv take over and talk about our Who Made My Clothes campaign.
Thank you, Delphine. So as Delphine kind of touched upon, one of our first campaigns as an organization was the hashtag Who Made My Clothes campaign. So that was really launched following the Rana Plaza collapse, recognizing the need for greater transparency in the supply chain. So it was a way for like consumers, just anyone who wanted to know who made my clothes, like posting the hashtag, posting a photo, which you can see this logo here, just posting a photo using the hashtag. And we actually had, brands and producers respond and share stories saying, hashtag I made your clothes on social media, as well as through other events, shop displays, blog posts, videos, podcasts, and more. And it's really just a question about empowering people to demand greater transparency and accountability from fashion brands and standing in solidarity with workers throughout the supply chain. And what's interesting about this hashtag, I mean, it's been used over 800,000 times, probably even more. I'm not sure if this figure is exactly up to date, but what's really great about this campaign is that we've seen it kind of iterated in other areas. For example, I saw a beauty company using like a who made my shea butter hashtag, and we know that it's an homage to this campaign. So it's interesting to see it kind of divulging in other areas. Even though that's not our campaign, it's clear that we've really inspired other people for this demand for more transparency. So following on, this year we launched our Who Made My Fabric campaign. We called upon citizens everywhere to demand greater transparency from brands by asking who made my fabric. And we would have brands and producers respond and say, I made your fabric. And it's really about drawing connections with people who produce our fabrics and the raw materials we wear. As we know, and as this session has highlighted, there's a lack of transparency the further down the supply chain you go. So it's really acknowledging those workers at the raw material and raw material processing levels. So we worked closely with civil society organizations, and we heard stories directly from hundreds of garment and textile workers. And just to summarize the impact of that campaign so far, we had nearly 4,000 emails sent by citizens to brands demanding transparency beyond the first tier. We had 5,000 Instagram posts asking who made my fabric, and over 1,000 brands and producers responded. And we had over 100 influencer and press features globally. And as Delphine said, the more people that email brands, the greater pressure that they feel to implement a policy. So we have those email brand tools available on our website. So you can participate as well. And following on, we also have a What's in My Clothes campaign, and that's really just acknowledging, what is the environmental impact of the way that my clothes are produced, what chemicals are, being used, are brands being transparent about their efforts to phase out hazardous use of chemicals, are they disclosing their, water-related risk assessments and so on. So since the launch of that campaign, there's been, nearly 30,000 hashtags that are using What's in My Clothes. So one of the main outputs of Fashion Revolution is our Fashion Revolution Week. So it coincides, it's a week of action that coincides with the anniversary of Rana Plaza. So it's about demanding change and accountability in the industry. And every year we have a different theme for Fashion Revolution Week. So the theme for this year from 2021 was rights, relationships, and revolution. And it was recognizing that human rights and the rights of nature are interconnected and interdependent, and that it was about acknowledging that human exploitation and ecosystem degradation are the product of centuries of colonialism and globalized exploitation. So for Fashion Revolution Week, we joined forces with 5 leading nonprofit organizations, including Canopy, to campaign for change together, producing a range of content and virtual events on both social and environmental issues across the industry. And over here, we have summarized some of the outcomes of Fashion Revolution Week. So for example, we had 63,000 reads of our free resources that we publish. We had a global press reach of nearly 5 billion views and impressions. We gained 177 new followers across our social media accounts, nearly 2,000 press features, and we've engaged nearly 600 million people across our different social media channels in just this 1 week alone. For example, the Fashion Revolution hashtag was used 4.2 million times. So it's just an amazing week of activism, of different events and talks. We can hear directly from people that are impacted by, for example, the climate crisis and garment producing countries. It's a way of really platforming those voices of vulnerable people, as well as, highlighting important research that's taking place and really engaging in discussion with thought leaders in different topics. And then next, we have the Fashion Transparency Index project, which Delphine kind of touched upon already, but we first started to publish the Fashion Transparency Index in 2017, I believe. And year on year, we've increased the number of brands. So just kind of walk it back a bit. The Fashion Transparency Index analyzes and ranks 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers based on their public disclosure of human rights and environmental policies, practices, and impacts in their own operations and in their supply chains. So as I kind of touched upon in the introduction to this session, the reason we focus on transparency is because it's a critical first step to have a more fair, accountable fashion industry, because we need transparency because it enables scrutiny that leads to accountability, which ultimately leads to change. And the reason why we have it formulated as an index is because we want to leverage brands' competitive tendencies. So by that, I mean, brands obviously want to be seen as doing well and being transparent. So by having an index, it really encourages them to disclose more information year on year. And for example, this year, the average score was 23%. And, out of 100, and that's the average score across all 250 brands. And we still feel that is too low. And the highest scoring brand this past year was 78%. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that when a brand scores 78%, or even if they scored 100%, that doesn't mean that they are a sustainable brand. It just means they're disclosing all of the necessary information that we view as important to kind of illuminate these human rights and environmental issues across the supply chain. And I'll just quickly summarize some of our key findings from this year's index. So it revealed slow progress in crucial areas. For example, the majority of major fashion brands, 99% of them, do not disclose the number of workers in their supply chain that are being paid a living wage, because if there is no disclosure, this is concerning because if there is no disclosure, we cannot track what brands are actually doing. And further, just 96% publish a roadmap. 96% do not publish a roadmap on how they plan to achieve a living wage for all workers in their supply chain. So not only are brands not disclosing the number of workers in the supply chain who receive a living wage, very few are publishing a roadmap to achieve this, which makes me question, how are they prioritizing, achieving a living wage? We know that garment workers are vulnerable. So that, Delphine can talk more about that when she talks about the ECI campaign. But we also saw that, we know that carbon emissions occur at processing. The most carbon emissions occur at processing and raw material levels. And while 62% of big brands publish their carbon footprint in their own facilities, only 26% disclose this information at processing and manufacturing level, and only 17% do so at raw material level. So there's less disclosure the further down the supply chain you go, and yet the most emissions occur at these more opaque parts of the supply chain. So we're in a climate crisis, and it's necessary that this information is being tracked and disclosed. Brands cannot monitor what they do not measure, so it's really important that brands are more transparent about the efforts they're taking. And finally, over a quarter, 27% of major brands disclose some of their processing facilities, like spinning mills, dye houses, and laundries. And this is up from 24% last year. So it's increased by 3 percentage points. And also it's encouraging to see greater disclosure year on year. We need more transparency and faster to address the human and environmental impacts of the industry. And just quickly, I forgot to mention that we have the Fashion Transparency Index Global, which analyzes 250 of the world's largest brands. But we also have a Fashion Transparency Index for Brazil and also for Mexico, which are available in Portuguese and English, and of course, like Spanish and English. But they focus on the same areas, public disclosure of brands from these countries. And I think that's it. I'm going to hand it over to Delphine. I'm sorry if I spoke quickly, just aware of time.
Great, thank you, Liv. So we are also launching a very exciting and definitely needed campaign at EU level. So we're launching a European Citizens Initiative to call on the European Commission to introduce new legislation requiring brands and retailers in the garment sector to conduct due diligence on living wages within their supply chain. So what does that actually mean? So first of all, due diligence on living wage across your supply chain. This legislation would apply to any brand or retailer wanting to sell their products within the EU, regardless of where their supply chain is. So let's say a brand sells their clothes in Belgium. If their supply chain is also partly based in Bangladesh, India, and so on, they would still need to conduct due diligence on living wages. So it would be a groundbreaking legislation to be passed. And the reason why we are launching this is in line with the mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, the MHR-EDD that Marta mentioned earlier. So we were hoping to align ourselves to this upcoming legislation. And as we know, there is not a strong component looking at living wages. We thought it was key to launch this campaign in order to include a living wage dimension as part of the MHR-EDD. So I'll go into what a European Citizens Initiative is to explain how it works. So a European Citizens Initiative enables citizens to call on the European Commission, which is the body that suggests and drafts legislation that are then voted on, to propose legislation in an area of EU competence. So the reason why we are aligning ourselves to an existing legislation is because if we propose a campaign, we know that in order for the European Commission to accept it, there is more chance of it being accepted if there is an existing legislation that already has some of the legal aspects of the campaign we would like to propose. So in order for an ECI to be successful, we need to collect 1 million citizens' signature from EU citizens, so they can live either in the EU or abroad as long as they are EU citizens. And this allows us to, again, after we collect these signatures within a 12-month period, we are then able to directly talk to the European Commission around the legal proposal that we have submitted. So how does it work? So a citizens committee is formed of at least 7 EU citizens, and they will be sort of the face of the campaign. So as soon as we submit the proposal to the European Commission, this proposal will be submitted by our citizens committee, who are individuals that we've selected. And within this 12-month period, they will be the face of the campaign. They will promote it actively, and they will help us reach 1 million signatures within those 12 months. So if we do get to 1 million signatures, we are then able to discuss with the European Commission and hold a public hearing at the EU Parliament. And if the EU Commission decides to propose legislation, the European Parliament and the Council of the EU will decide on whether to move forward or not with this legislation. So the reason why we are launching this is not simply because we want to collect 1 million signatures. Ultimately, we also want this campaign to be a strong signal at EU level that we need legislation on living wages. And we find this is the perfect time to do so, as garment workers worldwide have been massively impacted by COVID, in addition to already earning poverty wages. So we feel this is the right time to actually put in place a living wage legislation at EU level. And this is also why I'll move on to the how to take action slide. So there's many ways we as citizens and we as advocates can take action on not only supporting this specific ECI campaign, but also to support greater legislation for the fashion industry and advocate for change within the industry from a brand's perspective, from a consumer's perspective, as well as from a legal perspective. So I've listed out a few resources here. So we've got our how to get involved packs. So we've got one specific pack for citizens. We've got one specific pack for educators and students. We also have a calendar with different events across the year. So how to be a fashion revolutionary 365 days a year, another resource that is quite useful. Our policy dialogue toolkit. This is particularly relevant if you have a specific issue that you would like to campaign on and change legislation on. So I definitely recommend checking this resource out. And then we also, because we are very active on social media, and this is also how we manage to promote our campaigns and change consumer awareness ultimately. You can stay up to date by following our Instagram, our Twitter, our Facebook, or our LinkedIn to stay up to date with all our campaigns. And also by resharing what we're doing, we're also raising awareness and also gaining support on these different human rights and environmental issues. Lastly, we also have a dedicated page on the climate crisis. I would definitely recommend checking this out, especially post COP26, as we've listed out some key actions that you can take in order to raise awareness on how the climate crisis is linked to the fashion industry and how the fashion industry massively contributes to the climate crisis, and why we should be taking action, not only as citizens, but also why brands should take action and why we should have legislation for the fashion industry on these issues. And lastly, you're welcome to support our upcoming campaign by checking out our website, goodclothesfairpay.eu. So I think that's it. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and sorry about running over a little bit.